Years ago, I threw away a 100-page world-building Bible. Maps, magic systems, cultural details, everything. Why? Because I realized I had created an elaborate museum when I wanted a living world. After 2 decades of crafting fantasy worlds, I discovered something crucial. The most compelling worlds are not built on endless details. They are built on understanding how things connect. The difference between a world readers visit and one they never want to leave isn't in how much you create, it's in how it all flows together. Want to know one of my biggest mistakes in fantasy world building? Thinking power comes from the crown. Let me show you what I learned the hard way over the years. I once created a complex magical communication system for one of my worlds. Crystal orbs that could transmit messages instantly across continents, enchanted scrolls that could copy themselves 1,000 times. But something fell off. My world had perfect communication, but no one was really talking. Then something changed. I spent an afternoon in my local coffee shop and watched how information actually moved. Through whispers and nods, through subtle signals and shared glances. That's when it hit me. I'd built a fantasy postal system when I should have been building a living network of human connections. Here's what makes information feel real. It transforms as it travels. Each person who passes along a message adds their own interpretation, their own flavor. They decide what to tell and who to keep it from. Let's make this practical. Most fantasy writers focus on official channels. Royal messengers, magical scrolls, crystal balls. But here's the truth. Information doesn't move through official channels, at least not always. It moves through relationships. In my own world, I started by mapping out how a single piece of gossip would travel from a castle kitchen to the royal court. First, the kitchen maid tells her sister who works at the tavern. The tavern keeper who overhears that conversation mentions it to a merchant, who then shares it with a noble while discussing prices. 3 days later, the king hears secret intelligence from his advisor, who got it from his wife, the best friend of the noble's wife. And the most interesting part for me was following that same piece of gossip down the chain. Suddenly I had hedge witches running underground networks to survive. Merchant guilds weren't just trading goods anymore, they were trading secrets. Even in the palace, where court mages monitored every crystal orb, servants developed their own subtle codes to share secrets right under their master's nose. See what's happening? Real power isn't in the magic, it's in who controls the message. To discover similar depth in your own world, start by watching your characters interact. Not just the obvious meetings and messages, but the quiet moments, the whispered warnings, the strategic silences, the calculated slips of information. Ask yourself what each group desperately needs to know, and more importantly, what they'll risk everything to keep hidden. But having said that, there is something many writers miss completely. Information networks don't exist in isolation. They are powered by something even more fundamental: trade. What if I told you that a single trade route could change your entire magic system? Think about this. In our world, the invention of refrigeration didn't just keep food cold, it completely transformed where humans could live, how cities could grow, and even how we think about time. Now imagine what a magical preservation spell would do in your fantasy world. Most fantasy writers start with magic systems or political structures, but there's something more fundamental happening beneath the surface. Consider 2 versions of the same fantasy world. In the first version, a powerful mage creates a spell that preserves food. Cool magic, right? But in the second version, a merchant guild discovers this spell and starts using it for trade. Suddenly, cities can grow larger because they can store food longer. Desert kingdoms become viable because they can preserve imported goods. Magical preservation becomes a commodity more valuable than gold. The entire balance of power shifts, not because of the spell itself, but because of how it moves through your world. Let me show you how this works in practice. In my latest fantasy world, I started with a simple question. What if magical herbs lost their power within days of being picked? At first, this seemed tiny, but then I traced how it would actually move through my world. Healers couldn't stockpile herbs, so they needed constant fresh supplies. This meant every major city needed herb gardens or incredibly fast trade routes to places where these herbs grew naturally. Suddenly I had merchant caravans racing against time, using expensive preservation spells just to keep their cargo viable. And here's what gets even more exciting. Regions that controlled these herb growing places didn't just have resources, they had leverage. Cities started paying premium prices for properties with the right growing conditions. Merchant guilds began hiring adventurers to scout new herb sources in dangerous territories. Even the local farming communities gained unexpected power because without them, the entire magical economy could wither in days. This one trait element didn't just add detail to my world, it created natural conflicts, shaped city development, and gave ordinary people genuine power in a world of magic. But speaking of power, what if I told you the most influential person in your fantasy world might not even wear a crown or cast spells? They might just bake bread. The day I realized my fantasy world's mage council was powerless without a woman who sold bread, everything changed. Every morning in the city of New Haven, the Circle of Mages meets in their chambers within the Citadel of Dawn to discuss the fate of nations. And every morning, in a small bakery near the Grand Bazaar, Maya kneads dough and shapes the actual fate of those same nations. Not through magic, not through trade, but through trust. Let me show you something fascinating here. In my early drafts of one of my novels, I wrote Maya as a simple merchant. But then I noticed something. Every single plot point somehow led through her bakery. Not because she was selling something special, but because of who she was to people. The Kingsguard captain stops by every morning, not just for bread, but for his moment of peace before duty. The Circle's apprentices come for lunch, sharing frustrations about their masters. Servants gossip while waiting in line. Merchants from the Grand Bazaar discuss routes over coffee. Children bring messages with their coin. And Maya? She listens. But this is also where too many writers stop too soon. Because this isn't just about information networks, it's about belonging. The guard captain, he trusts Maya's judgment about people because she saw his daughter grow up. The apprentices, they listen to her warnings because she bandaged their burns when spells went wrong. In most fantasy worlds, we create elaborate power structures, councils, guilds, noble houses. But real influence, that grows from 1,000 tiny moments of trust. The merchant who extends credit during hard times. The herbalist who keeps family secrets. The baker who knows when to look the other way. Let me share a practical example here as well. When I remapped New Haven's power structure, I stopped asking who has authority and started asking who do people trust when it matters. The answers transformed my entire world. The Mighty Merchants Guild couldn't move without the goodwill of the dock workers who handled their cargo. The King's Spy Master relied on housekeepers more than trained agents. And that impressive circle of mages? They discovered that all their power meant nothing when the common folk started closing their doors to them. So here's your world building challenge. Pick any authority figure in your world. Now trace back their last 3 major decisions. Not to other powerful figures, but to the ordinary people whose trust they needed. That's where your story's real power lives. Remember, influence isn't about who can compel others to act. It's about who people turn to when the official solutions fail. But there is something even more fundamental than people shaping your world. It's time to talk about resources. Not gold or magic crystals, but the things people cannot live without. Picture this, 2 kingdoms going to war over a mountain range. Sounds familiar, right? You probably heard it in some point eventually. But what if I told you they weren't fighting for territory or pride? They were desperate for the mountain's salt deposits. Now we're talking about survival. Many fantasy writers dive straight into magical resources, enchanted crystals, mythical metals, sources of arcane power. But there's something they miss in that instance. The most powerful resources in your world are the ones people cannot live without. Salt, fresh water, fertile soil, timber. Think about salt for a moment here. In our world, entire trade empires rose and fell controlling salt routes. Cities were built where salt could be harvested. Wars were fought over access to salt mines. Why? Because without salt, people died. Their food spoiled, their livestock suffered. Now imagine what happens when you add magic to that equation. Let's play this out in a hypothetical world. That salt mine isn't just producing a precious preservative. What if those same minerals amplify healing spells? Suddenly you've got healing guilds establishing hospitals near salt deposits, merchant caravans hiring battle mages to protect shipments, salt workers developing unique forms of magic that only they can perform. Every resource in your world can have both mundane and magical properties, creating natural connections and conflicts. Want to see how deep this goes? Pick the most basic resource in your world, let's say fresh water. Now trace its path. Where does it come from? Who controls access? How do they maintain that control? What happens when the supply is threatened? And how does magic interact with it? Suddenly you're not just mapping resources, you're discovering the pressure points that drive your entire world. Now, before we dive into our final chapter, here's something you won't want to miss, my free weekly newsletter. Each Friday, hundreds of fantasy writers get practical tips and insights just like these, designed to help you build deeper fantasy worlds and stories in just 5 minutes a week. You can find the link in the description below. Moving on, we cannot end this video without talking about your world's environment. A desert's mage fireball dies in the humid jungle. A coastal wizard's water magic surges during high tide. Environment doesn't have to be just scenery. It can be a living force shaping everything, including magic itself. Here's what I struggled with for too long, but finally learned to embrace. Magic isn't just a tool characters use, it's part of their world's natural system. Just like wind patterns shape trees, just like rivers carve valleys, magic flows through your world in patterns that make organic sense. Let me show you how this can transform your world. Instead of creating arbitrary rules for your magic system, start by asking how it interacts with weather conditions, seasonal changes, geographic features, natural cycles, and local ecosystems. Think about the weather first here. In our world, humidity affects everything from how bread rises to how fast metal rusts. In your world, maybe high humidity dampens fire magic but amplifies water spells. Low pressure systems might create magical storms. Drought could force magical energy to concentrate in unexpected ways. Seasons then add another layer here. Spring magic naturally lends itself to growth and renewal, but what happens when someone tries to use death magic during this season? Summer's intense energy might make spells more powerful but harder to control. Autumn magic excels at transformation, while winter magic becomes subtle but persistent. This isn't just about making your magic system more logical, it's about creating a world that feels alive. When magic responds to environmental conditions, your characters can't just memorize spells. They have to understand the world on a deeper level. They become not just magic users, but students of nature itself. Basically, what started with throwing away my world-building Bible so many years ago led me to something far more valuable: understanding how living worlds actually work. Not through rules and systems, but through connections and patterns. When I stopped trying to control every detail and started watching how elements naturally influence each other, my worlds began breathing on its own. Information flowed through relationships. Trade shaped how magic evolved. Power grew from trust. Resources created natural conflicts. And everything danced to the rhythm of environmental forces. But all these powerful details mean nothing when the foundation of your world isn't solid enough. So watch this video here next and follow along through the entire World Building Fundamentals series.